Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation. This is Coffee and Wisdom, and this week we have been looking at a literary trope, and that is the chapel perilous and how it morphs through time, where it came from, and how it keeps gaining speed within our culture. So, yes, it comes from, it appears that it first was written as that term in Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Mallory back in the 1400s. But the question this week has been, how did a book compiling Arthurian legends become the source for all kinds of interesting things? Chapel perilous is an occult term nowadays, referring to a psychological state in which an individual cannot be certain whether they have been aided or hindered by some force outside the realm of the natural world, or whether what appeared to be a supernatural interference was actually the product of their own vivid imaginations. And I mentioned that there is a pedigree to this, and it keeps going on. I have mentioned this book before by Eric Davis, a professor of the weird, called High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 1970s. And he is asking the question, is society itself now trapped in chapel perilous? So from an Arthurian legend to a question about American society, how did that happen? Yesterday, quick recap, I traced through how it came back into the popular American imagination through the 1922 poem, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and his sources that he mentioned, so that undergraduates for a couple of generations there were reading this poem and also learning about a couple of books that predated it. Jesse L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. It's an account of the Holy Grail from ancient ritual to Christian symbol. The Holy Grail, of course, being the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper. That legend had it, then became encrusted in jewels and gold, and stuck around in Europe to be found by the Knights of the Round Table. Whether or not any of that is true is completely unknown. Also, a book of anthropology called The Golden Bough, and the look at the way that at least the anthropologists of the late 19th century thought that religion had developed out of shamanistic and magic practices, and then with the ideas of the time anyway, that stage of religion would then be superseded by a world of science and the understanding of how things worked. I mentioned that part of this then in the next generation, in the 1940s and 50s, developed into Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey. At the time in philosophy, this was called structuralism, looking for large structural ideas. And this is one of the classic books of structuralism, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the idea that there is an underlying hero's journey map that we can look at that really explains how lots and lots and lots of different plots work. Today, we need to go on into the idea of how this becomes important in our own time. And we have to begin back in the 1970s with the Illuminatus Trilogy that appeared in 1975, and written by a couple of people, Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. Robert Anton Wilson here is saying, I don't believe anything, but I have my suspicions. Very popular book. Robert Anton Wilson lived from 1932 to 2007. He was interested in quantum mechanics and quantum psychology and neurology, as evidenced by this book from 1990, Quantum Psychology, How Brain Software Programs You and Your World, and another trilogy that he wrote, Schrodinger's Cat Trilogy. So very interested in quantum mechanics and the ideas on the cutting edge of mathematics and physics. He was, and I had mentioned this before a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about parody religions, he was a Discordian. Principia Discordia is a book from the early 1960s, very popular in the San Francisco of the 1960s, would probably have disappeared except for the use of Robert Anton Wilson when he brought it into the Illuminatus Trilogy. Now we find from Wilson here how he thinks about theology, the function of theology, quote, the recitation of the incomprehensible by the unspeakable to pick the pockets of the unthinking. So that's how he's thinking about how theology works. Yeah, not such a positive view, but he is interested in the natural, supernatural line between those two things and in conspiracy theories. I showed this slide a couple of days ago. Lumi says, buy my Chapel Perilous insurance. Chapel Perilous insurance doesn't exist, but neither do you in Chapel Perilous. What is this all about? Well, it goes back to the Illuminatus Trilogy then. This is a summary, and again, the trilogy was published in 1975, has not been out of print since, and it has become very popular in both science fiction and also the world of conspiracy ideas. This is a summary. It was a deadly mistake. Joseph Malik, editor of a radical magazine, had snooped into rumors about an ancient secret society that was still alive and kicking. This is the Illuminati that is part of the joke of Discordianism, by the way. Now his offices have been bombed. He's missing, and the case has landed in the lap of a tough, cynical, streetwise New York detective by the name of Saul Goodman. And Saul Goodman knows he's stumbled onto something big, but even he can't guess how far into the pinnacles of power this conspiracy of evil has penetrated. So you see, this is the setup for very boilerplate, pot boiler kinds of writing, but it kind of transcends that because it has this underbelly. Saul Goodman, I should mention, becomes a character in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. That's his name anyway, but as you know, if you have watched Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, that's not his real name. So where did he get the idea of calling himself Saul Goodman? Oh, it could be a conspiracy. You'll have to stay tuned to find out. Well, this goes on with the summary of the Illuminatus Trilogy, filled with sex and violence in and out of time and space. The three books of the Illuminatus Trilogy are only partly works of the imagination. They tackle all the cover-ups of our time, from who really shot the Kennedys to why there's a pyramid on a $1 bill, and suggest a mind-blowing truth. And so who wouldn't want to read about these mind-blowing truths that will be exposed through the Discordian idea of the Illuminati? Robert Anton Wilson said this: reality is not a singular noun, it's a plural verb. And this is how Wilson is really going about the idea of how do we get at reality, which isn't probably as it appears. And he has this to say, bear with me a little bit, so we can kind of go into the next level of this. He says, in researching occult conspiracies, one eventually faces a crossroad of mythic proportions called Chapel Perilous in the trade. You come out the other side either stone paranoid or an agnostic. There is no third way. I came out agnostic. He goes on to say, Chapel Perilous, like the mysterious entity called I, cannot be located in the space-time continuum. It is weightless, odorless, tasteless, and undetectable by ordinary instruments. Indeed, like the ego, it is even possible to deny that it is there. And yet, even more like the ego, once you are inside it, there doesn't seem to be any way to ever get out again until you suddenly discover that it has been brought into existence by thought and does not exist outside thought. We are veering quickly into mysticism, as you can see, and he goes on to say, everything you fear is waiting with slavering jaws in Chapel Perilous. But if you are armed with the wand of intuition, the cup of sympathy, the sword of reason, and the pentacle of valor, you will find there, the legends say, the medicine of metals, the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone, true wisdom, and perfect happiness. Now, this is all referring to parts of the Arthurian legend, although on Monday, we looked at the actual appearance of Chapel Perilous, and we know, for example, that the wand of intuition does not appear there, and the cup of sympathy, that would be the chalice, or doesn't appear in that particular story, although it does appear in other versions of the Chapel Perilous out of France. So he goes on to say, that's what the legends always say, and the language of myth is poetically precise. For instance, if you go into that realm without the sword of reason, you will lose your mind. But at the same time, if you take only the sword of reason without the cup of sympathy, you will lose your heart. Even more remarkably, if you approach without the wand of intuition, you can stand at the door for decades, never realizing you have arrived. You might think you are just waiting for a bus or wandering from room to room looking for your cigarettes, watching a TV show, or reading a cryptic and ambiguous book. Chapel Perilous is tricky that way. And so Anton Wilson is really trying to point out that how he is using the idea of Chapel Perilous is this moment, a crossroads in the psychological realm in which one does or doesn't cross over into some kind of enlightenment, although we aren't quite clear what that might be. It can be becoming paranoid that all of these conspiracies are actually true, and the world is a very weird place indeed. Or it could be into what he calls agnosticism, not exactly religious agnosticism, as in not really knowing if there's a God or not, and kind of putting brackets around that and saying, well, I just don't know, but rather the idea that everything may be questionable in our ways of seeing reality. Now, what is happening here is the hero's journey is being conflated with the shamanic vision quest. I mentioned that the hero's journey that's coming out of the ideas that are building into Lamort Darthur actually do lead to an idea about how plots and stories are told, and a structuralist idea. Now, also going on, and it does kind of appear within Arthurian legend to some extent that this hero's journey is also some kind of vision quest, not certainly a shamanic vision quest, which had been forgotten by the time of medieval Europe and been subsumed into Christianity, such that people didn't even know that this thing had existed among Europeans anyway at that time. It was over in the New World and in Africa, etc. But the two are being conflated. They don't have to be the same thing, and usually they aren't. The hero's journey does indeed lead to some understandings of the underworld and mysterious things, but it isn't the same idea as finding out your spirit animal and those kinds of ideas that come out of actual shamanism. So this is how this all ties together. We'll talk more about Neo-Shamanism tomorrow. I will just give you a little headline from the Huffington Post. Neo-Shamanism, a call to the Western animistic soul. It says, the path of shamanism in the West is a curious thing. The dogmatic world religions of our ancestors are crumbling as institutions no longer meet the needs of the modern spiritual seeker. And this by Kelly Harrell, an author and a modern shaman. Now, I very quickly point out that Neo-Shamanism, yes, you can read Neo-Shamanism 101, The Way of the Shaman, is not ancient shamanism. Often people will argue that, as a matter of fact, it is co-opted from the indigenous elements and really shouldn't be that way, but it's there and as very much a movement. Also, we know from recent events at the U.S. Capitol that neo-shamanism and conspiracy theories have been conflated in the minds of many people. You can definitely be a vegan vegetarian and also a neo-shaman and also a believer in right-wing conspiracy theories, QAnon and that kind of thing. So all of this has become confused in the wider culture, but that's the pedigree of how this comes down to us. And we'll look a little bit more at how these ideas are shaking out. You too can go to the woods with a skeleton look to you in your costume, because there are lots and lots of places that you can sign up to join neo-shamanistic journeys should you wish to do so. But if you don't, I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll talk a little bit more about these ideas and how they fit together in the contemporary religious maelstrom that we live in today. Thanks a lot for listening. Tonight, Bibles and Beer, episode 22, Joseph the Trickster. I'll be going through some of the ideas that of the stories of Joseph in the book of Genesis, from chapter 37 all the way to the end of the book. He's a huge part of Genesis, and some of the trickster stories when he's down in Egypt. Thanks for listening today, and I'll see you tonight or back tomorrow. Thank you.